Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining today's webinar brought to you by Demand Chain AI and Pulse 8. My name is Jason Steegent. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, From Complexity to Clarity, AI-driven planning for smarter, more sustainable operations. Really excited to have you. It's going to be a great conversation with a guy that knows a lot about this topic. So his name's Dr. Kevin O'Flynn. I'm excited that he's here. I'm going to introduce him here momentarily. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. All in 35, maybe 40 minutes with a Q&A on the back end. Speaking of the Q&A, you'll see that box that's open. If you have any questions for Kevin today, just type in your questions, click submit. We will get to as many of them as we can. If you want to share this with your colleagues via social channels, anything like that, you'll see some icons at the bottom of your screen that enable you to do that. If you have any support questions or needs, you'll see an option that enables you to do that as well. Regarding the environment, all the windows you see have min-max options. If you want to view this media player in full screen mode, just maximize that window and you're good to go. And then finally, we are recording today's webinar. Be on the lookout for the on-demand version within the next 24 hours, so you'll have access to learn or relearn or just consume yourself with what you watch today. If you weren't able to join us, don't worry about it. You'll have access to the on-demand version as well. But without further ado, I wanted to briefly introduce Dr. Kevin O'Flynn. He's a global strategy executive at Demand Chain AI with a wealth of experience in supply chain planning, and AI. Kevin, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and tell everybody a little bit about what you guys are doing over at Demand Chain AI today.
Thanks very much, Jason. Delighted to be here and welcome everyone. My background has been in manufacturing for probably close to the last 25 years. I did a PhD in the field a long time ago, and then I've worked in a range of different sectors, a lot of heavily regulated ones like medical devices and aerospace, and I probably spent the last maybe 10 years working with process manufacturers, mainly in the food and beverage space. And my focus has really been on helping them to understand how to use emerging technologies. That was RPA and automation a while ago. That's really focused on AI in the last couple of years, and now it's moving into more agentic AI and much more of that automation piece. And it's really helping executives and their teams to understand how to use those tools to drive better outcomes. Most often that's been around sustainability, both financially and environmentally. And I should take this opportunity to introduce Demand Chain as well. So Demand Chain was founded in 2018 by Rick Davis, a former Kellogg's exec. He's the real driving force behind the company. He'd spent a considerable amount of time in the demand planning space. He'd really seen some of the challenges around getting better demand planning outcomes, even with all of the tools that they had available. It's a challenge for every organization. He was kind of looking over the horizon, looking at some of the emerging technologies that were coming out back then, and really wanted to try and make those tools more accessible, not just to the bigger companies, but to smaller mid-market companies as well. Since then, Demand Chain, or DCAI, as I call it, has grown from strength to strength. We now have more than 50 professionals across product, data, and planning. And I think what really differentiates Demand Chain is the focus on hiring people who are highly experienced in the field. So lots of people on the team would have 20, 25, 30 years of industry experience. So that makes for that exceptionally seasoned group of people who've seen these problems, who've seen that evolution. A huge amount about what we'll talk about today is it's classic business transformation, it's classic process transformation. Yes, we're using better tools. Yes, those tools are very exciting. But ultimately, having people who've done this before, who know where the pitfalls are, has been immensely helpful. And if going a bit more deep on the platform and expertise side of things, we focus on really three core areas. We've got integrated planning. That's such an important piece when we think about supply chain planning for every organization. We'll often look at advanced AI and machine learning and cloud-based architectures as tools to solve those problems. And then I've already talked a little bit about that practitioner-led delivery as well. Now, today, the kind of planning stack that I'm going to talk about for the next couple of minutes is what we would call our intelligent planning ecosystem. So that's a framework that knits together a series of AI tools that use both machine learning and artificial intelligence, really looking to drive better planning, not just in a specific area, but across the entire chain. So at the bottom layer, that dark blue one, That's Pulse8 Replan. So that's the product I own that was really focused on using AI to do constraint optimization planning on the supply planning space. I would say typically with more traditional approaches, you'll see that really focused just on the scheduling horizon, maybe week 0, 1, and 2, maybe stretching it out to 3 or 4. By using AI that allows us to take that accuracy that you normally see reserved for that planning window and extending it out to any horizon we want to look at. So that's typically 16 weeks kind of S&OP horizon or S&OE horizon, but it could be 52 or 104 weeks as appropriate for the right business. We layer on top of that then demand sensing. So demand sensing uses advanced machine learning to optimize the demand plan in the 0 to 60-day window, where orders start to have a significant influence on how that demand profile is going to develop. By having a more accurate signal, we can have lower forecast error. Lower forecast error means that we can recalculate the safety stocks, and then we can pass those into replan to ultimately give us lower inventory while protecting service. And these two products that sit on the demand and supply space, we can then feed the results of those into the peak of the pyramid there, which is Correlate, which is our integrated metrics management system. And because those KPIs are so highly correlated or interrelated, that's where we can start to do some really advanced analytics to understand the impact of those. So for example, we might be able to achieve excellent service levels, but if that comes at the cost of higher inventory, then that's a suboptimal outcome. So trying to get that balance is really what we're trying to look for.
So I know there's going to be a focus on manufacturing today, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and all the disruption that these manufacturers are forced with, thinking AI is the solution for that disruption. So on this next slide, Kevin, you hit on this a little bit. So can you just elaborate in terms of the challenge that manufacturers are faced with today, and then kind of the roadmap that they need to follow to navigate through those challenges and come out on top?
Sure. I go to a lot of trade shows, so I kind of hear, I see what manufacturers are being bombarded with from the markets in terms of the noise around AI, but also the market that they're trying to sell and operate in terms of the complexity and the speed of change that they see. On the AI side, there is so much noise about automation, AI, Gen AI, Claude, ChatGPT, agentic AI, related technologies. And I hear a lot of CEOs under pressure to adopt AI because they think their competitors are doing it. So they want to do AI projects. But I would say without a clear understanding of what tool is right for what problem and what your strategy is, or indeed what problems you're trying to solve, that's inherently going to be a challenging road to go down. And then when I think about the challenges that are facing supply chain teams, the kind of environment that they're trying to operate in, I love the quote from Justin Trudeau that the pace of change has never been this fast and it'll never be this slow again. And for me, it resonates so true for supply chain teams. The level of kind of global volatility that we're seeing, it makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to keep up with that kind of change. And when I talk to those planning teams and those executives, in the smaller and the mid-market size, so many of them are managing their businesses, their teams, their planning, both in demand and supply, in some combination of whiteboards, spreadsheets, and a huge number of emails being exchanged. And that's a really difficult way to try and operate in such a volatile environment. And what ends up happening inevitably is your data gets fragmented across several spreadsheets. You're trying to balance service levels with inventory, and you're trying to do that as quickly as possible. And it becomes that impossible ask for your planners to try and keep on top of it. So the natural result that I see from planners is their planning horizon starts to shorten. They're like, great, we'd love to plan a supply plan at 16 weeks, but hey, we just don't have capacity. Let's do 2 weeks or a week, and let's try and keep on top of that. And with demand planning, great, let's plan 52 weeks, but they might say, well, actually, we're just going to refresh it on a weekly basis, and hopefully we'll just try and catch the short-term demand. That's where I think we can look for a more structured, repeatable, automatable process. It's where AI and automation tools can make a massive difference. They'll give us more actionable insights. They'll support planners to make better decisions. And again, I'll come back to the point made at the start that I think the challenge for manufacturers is trying to figure out where to use these tools and how to use them best.
Yeah. You and I before the call, well, we've talked for a couple weeks now and prep for this webinar. You've got some really interesting Gartner research that digs in about where to use AI. So on this next slide, I believe it's this next slide. There it is. Why don't you speak to this a little bit? Because there's some, I mean, just that one stat, 84% gets stuck in the pilot phase. So speak to this a little bit because it's really some interesting research that you dug up.
Yeah, so I was in Gartner in their supply chain symposium in Orlando about a month ago. It's where I picked up this research, and like that, it really resonated with me. So we talk about where can I use AI? Because I have so many different processes. I've got spreadsheets all over my business. And Gartner did a survey of global executives in a range of different industries, and the feedback is very clear that over half of them say planning is the area where I want to try and focus my AI efforts. And so why planning? Well, if we look at distribution logistics, that's a relatively solved problem. AI has made a phenomenal difference in things like route planning and last mile logistics and being able to optimize those and really sweat the dollars out of it. Planning is for me, it's even more complex. It's that interface between the operational reality of factories that are changing every day, demand that's quite uncertain, and then trying to interface those two together into a constrained and feasible plan. So it's a real challenge, and I think that's why we're seeing such interest in trying to find solutions to improve that planning piece and why it ranks so high. I think the other three stats below are the ones that are most concerning when I look at them. So great, we're going to focus on planning, but people aren't using any kind of a strategy about how they're approaching it. I see a huge number of experiments that are happening, and experiments are great. Right? That's how organizations learn. It's how you get people comfortable with the idea that AI is going to support them in their planning process. But without a strategy, without knowing where you're going in a more holistic way, my concern is that a huge number of those pilots are doomed to failure. And if we've got time, I've put some slides at the end where we can touch on some of the kind of core KPIs that I would look at when I'm running pilots to make sure that everybody in the project is very clear on what success looks like and how that's going to translate in ultimately into real business value and strategic drivers. So I think for me that strategy and that focus on how are we moving the needle for the business, not just a pilot, is so important. And then the bottom one is concerning, right? So it's reporting zero or ROI and AI means that that's natural with some pilots. You'll always have some pilots that will churn out, and it's just for experimentation. But for me, I think by starting with that business problem, and it's something I keep coming back to, that reduces the risk that those pilots are going to get stuck in pilot phase and not deliver any kind of ROI.
A lot of times it's all the craze. They feel like they have to do it, but there's no rhyme or reason for doing it. Right? There's no roadmap. There's no plan. There's no outcome-based model that's going to enable them to achieve that ROI because they don't know what ROI even looks like, right? If they don't have that plan in place. So AI had a massive impact on the planning side of supply chain. So talk a little bit about what does AI-driven planning actually look like, and what does that impact look like at that organizational level?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really depends on what's right for the organization. We're going to touch on a lot later that it's not the same answer for every organization, but there are some common themes that I try and draw. So there are kind of four core dimensions I often look at what the impact is going to be. So on the complexity side of it, AI should be able to handle much more complex environments and decisions than you can do manually. That's a core value that I would look for it to drive. And really that means that we should be able to increase the scope of what we think about. So whether that's finding a finer balance between service and inventory, or really it often looks at extending the planning horizon so I can have more visibility. I can look a little bit further down the road. I can make better decisions about what to do and when, what that sequencing looks like, how much inventory to hold. And ultimately, I'm trying to reduce the firefighting that's happening in the short to medium term and free my people to spend their time talking to stakeholders, managing the business more effectively as opposed to just running around firefighting. On the process or the planning process side of it, I would look for it to enable a shift from manually driven processes to more automated ones. I think that one's quite obvious. But the process transformation and what that looks like, I'm going to touch on that later on because I think that's a really important point. Sourcing allows us to look more upstream. We've got a better sense of what's going to happen, what we need to make, and when, and how we're going to meet the demand. AI should allow us to make more dynamic sourcing decisions. It should streamline that sourcing process. And that combination of a more accurate long-term signal combined with a better ability to respond quickly in the short term is where I look for it. And then inventory, what I'm trying to get here is a closer alignment between demand and supply. Like if I can mesh those two gears together, like I talked about with demand sensing and replan, that's really where I can start to unlock significant value. I've got supply, it's often changing on a daily basis, certainly at the scheduling level it is, whereas that demand planning is running weekly, maybe even a monthly cadence. So bridging that gap with a more automated planning cadence that's quite reliable, that eliminates some of that manual friction with reduced forecast error and a better starting position, that's going to deliver a meaningful reduction in inventory. And that's really what I'm looking for. And if I try and bring that to life, what I wanted to do is put a slide in here just to, what does that look like in terms of actual results? Because that's great in theory.
Yeah.
What does that mean when we actually do it in practice? So this was results I pulled from a recent piece of work we did with the customer that's anonymized. And it's a combination of machine learning on the top line, which is that demand sensing piece. And that's really looking at delivering an improvement in forecast accuracy and ultimately a reduction in forecast bias, usually in the 0 to 60-day window. Well, that's a key window when I think about supply planning. And then when I pass it into replan for the planning and scheduling part of it, we can take that reduction in forecast error, recalculate the safety stocks, and then reduce the inventory. Now, the interesting piece for me for this customer was, because that sounds simple in theory, right? I'll just calculate the safety stock and I'll run my inventory down. Their planning process, their production process has some big minimum lot size challenges. So the way that they make product can be quite lumpy for some products. So while the safety stock might be a lot lower, that might not be achievable. And by using an AI constrained engine like Replan, that allows us to look at the operational reality in a way that we can never do manually or in spreadsheets, and allows us to be able to find and chart a path through those rocky shoals and find a way that delivers the right service level, but with a significantly lower inventory, mainly because we're taking that longer horizon from a planning perspective. So if I'm planning not just a week or 2 weeks in advance, but 10, 12, 16 weeks in advance, I can make much better decisions, much more optimal decisions about what to make and when.
Tell me again, maybe double down on that, why the 0 to 60-day window is so important.
Yeah, it's a great question. For many of the manufacturers that we work with, that's where the vast majority of their orders are placed. So the orders that they have received have a much better impact, a much bigger impact on how much product is actually needed. So it's a much bigger impact than the forecast. So the orders start to outweigh the forecast at that stage. Beyond 45 or 60 days, you typically have very few orders. So you really have to rely on what you're getting out of your demand plan. Now, your demand planning area also can benefit from an improvement in approaches. So we would have used statistical demand planning for a long time. There are some great AI and machine learning enabled tools that allow you to get a better demand plan as well. So you get a better starting position.
Makes sense.
So this is very planning focused, and we're really in the weeds about KPIs. I think this is important because these are the core KPIs from a planning perspective that really move the needle. And this is how we measure success at a pilot level or at a planning level. But I talked earlier that it's really important to roll that up to, well, what does this mean for the business? How are we moving the needle at an executive level, at a board level? So when I think about it from that perspective, it's really around, ultimately it's driving better service levels and releasing working capital. That's the core of the discussion almost all the time. And by making better decisions about what inventory to hold, what inventory to make, we can free up warehouse space that was previously being blocked by wrong stock, where I've got risk of obsolescence, where I've got risk of waste. That can drive a meaningful improvement in service. That allows me, by holding lower inventory, I can release that working capital. And that means that my CFO or the CFO of the company is not necessarily going to be they're going to be much happier about it. But that's at a very kind of fiscal level. it has a massive impact on sustainability as well, right? If we're not wasting product, if we're making the right product at the right time in the right quantities, that directly ties into the sustainability goals of almost all of the manufacturers, and in fact, all of the manufacturers that I work with. So they're generating less waste across raw materials, packed materials, finished goods, and they can run their entire business in a leaner way. So I see a huge overlap between kind of lean initiatives, green initiatives, and AI digital initiatives as well. And then underpinning all of these is this idea that we can use AI and automation to make many of the decisions that were previously getting tied up in spreadsheets, emails, and meetings, and start to streamline those much quicker. The business can start to run much faster, and we free the people from that repetitive manual work, and ideally get them to focus on higher value activity. So when I think about, so that's the objective. That's where we're trying to get to. The next question for me then is how? How are we going to get there? And what does it mean in practice to implement these tools, right? And I very deliberately tried not to go down into the weeds about how each individual tool works and the specific nature of machine learning versus AI. For me, the much more interesting piece is the implementation and change management part of it. I find it helpful to kind of start with the premise that, hey, what we're doing here is there's existing processes that work. Like, we're not creating a new process. We're just trying to make an existing process work better. Those processes that are in play at the moment they're decisions that are being made by people. And the question we're trying to answer for me is, well, how much of that decision making do we want to automate? And in what way do we want to automate it? So at the very highest level, one framework to look at this is that it's how do we get machines and people to collaborate effectively? And there's a spectrum there. And it starts on the left at decision support, and it's on the right at decision automation. So the dip the toe in the water is to say, well, look, I'm going to use these tools to help my people to make decisions that they're already making. They can make them faster, they can make them better. Decision augmentation then is really that blended way where, hey, there's some decisions I can just fully automate to the machine. I get people to watch it very carefully, but ultimately I can get them out of having to make those mundane decisions. And then all the way on the right-hand side is saying, hey, I am going all in. I'm going to get the automation to run, and then I'll generate an audit trail and I'll have people check that in retrospect. So something like machine learning models in demand sensing sit on the right-hand side. They operate at high frequency. They make decisions. They'll update the demand forecast in the short-term horizon, and people can go in and check those in retrospect. On the supply planning side, we're not really there yet. So I would say for most of the time in supply planning automation, we're sitting definitely in the augmentation piece, probably around approval most of the time, maybe somewhere between recommend and approval. So I guess the point I'm going to keep coming back to is it's not one size fits all. There's always a blend. And what I wanted to do is even within an individual process, I guess my encouragement for people is to really understand your processes as well as you can. So here, this is another helpful graphic I borrowed from Gartner.
Yeah.
This is just looking at demand forecasting in the short-term horizon, where demand sensing can fit. And it's got two axes. At the bottom is how much value is the machine adding? So has it got high error, which is bad on the right-hand side, or low error, which is good on the left? And then on the y-axis is how much value is the planner? How much value is the person adding? On the bottom left, you've got your planners aren't really adding a huge amount of value. So you might have a stable portfolio. It's quite predictable, and your statistical forecast is giving you pretty good accuracy on it. And the machine error is quite low. That's a great candidate to say, we're not going to look at that. That is full decision automation. Just let the machines run. We'll check it in retrospect. We don't need to focus on that. On the top right's the opposite, where your planners have a really good understanding of what's happening in the market. The market is quite dynamic, and you don't have any, let's say, good machine learning models that can model what that is. So that error at the machine level is quite high. I would be very slow to rely on a machine to do that. And I would say that's a great area where I would want my planners focusing on that area. They're adding value, and they're adding much more value than the machine can do. So that's where we want to end up in high touch forecasting. For Most of the companies that I work with, certainly the smaller companies, they'll tend to sit in one of these four boxes. And most of their products will fit there. For larger companies with more complex portfolios, you can often see them moving around depending on how you cut the portfolio into a couple of these different boxes. And the takeaway from this slide for the audience is that, hey, it's not one solution. You've got to get in, you've got to understand your process. And that's why starting with the business problem, understanding those KPIs and understanding how to try and impact them is going to help you to make a better decision about what your AI strategy should look like, but ultimately what tool you should use to solve the problem. And often it's not one tool, it can be a range of different tools.
And you've been involved with so many of these implementations, these planning initiatives. What have you learned? What would you do differently if you could do some of these projects again? What would be the main things that you would lean on?
I'll probably do a lot of things differently depending on the project.
Yeah.
And that's true for everybody who's ever gone through business transformation and process transformation, right? These things are big and they're hard and ultimately can deliver massive value.
Mm-hmm.
For me, yeah, the biggest place where we've gone wrong is we've focused on we started with the technology, we've tried to focus on a very narrow piece. For me, I like to start with as high as we can go in terms of the business problem and figure out really what that is, what the KPIs we're trying to move are, and then figure out what the right technology is. Sometimes that's obvious. When we look at demand sensing, it's quite clear that the machine learning models are an excellent way to try and solve that problem. Oftentimes for other problems, it can be a little unclear what the right answer is. So in theory, I like to start at the business problem. I will say that there's lots of new technologies that have come up in maybe the last 6 or 12 months. Gen AI, agentic AI would be good examples of that. And the term I've heard that I like is they're spiky technologies. They're great at some really specific things, and they solve those problems amazingly well. But once you move outside of that relatively narrow scope, their ROI tends to fall off extremely rapidly. So sometimes if you have a tool, you should look at what it's great at solving and use it to solve that. So rather than it's not a hammer to hit every nail, that it's a very precision instrument on it. So yeah, there is merit in starting with the technology and looking at those problems that it's great in solving. The next piece is inevitably we're going to get snarled up in data. So you've got to fix your data first of all. If you want a repeatable, reliable, automated process that consistently delivers the right answer, you've got to have the right mastered data. And that's something we come back to again and again in every project that we do, that we've got to get the data right, first of all. The next piece is make sure that you understand what your process is actually doing. So I've talked in the demand sensing example about the nature of the process and the errors that can arise in it. Time and time again, I see where superhero firefighting is masking gaps in both the process and the data that you currently have. And it looks like a relatively smooth duck moving across a pond, but actually there's some furious activity happening underneath that is masking some of those issues. So the challenge then is when you start to work with AI and automation, it's going to surface those issues. You're going to have to go back and fix them. Doing that groundwork up front before you start to work on any AI pilot is going to help you. Because we often have those processes where it is a duck on a pond, inevitably things are going to take longer than we want, and that can be quite frustrating. Where even if we think we've done that due diligence up front, we fixed the process, we fixed the data, we're still going to find issues. And I think going in, understanding that that's going to happen is a massive lesson for me. And then the last one is you've got to encourage your team to get excited and to experiment with it a little. Like you've got to frame it in a way where it's a new technology. Yes, it's a little bit scary, but ultimately it's going to get us to where we need to be. And let's go and play with it a little bit. And if I kind of dig in on that a little bit more, I'll go back to the point I made earlier that what we're looking to do here is to automate partially or fully a process that's human-centric at the moment, and we're looking to try and support that with some automation. That change is a gradient, it's not a switch. It's not A or B, it's not binary. It's definitely a spectrum that we can move up and down. And again, I've already these stats from Gartner. It's kind of what you'd expect. Some people in your organization they don't want any AI. They don't want to go anywhere near it. Maybe a third of them will be really excited to get AI to try and automate it as much as possible. And then roughly half your organization are like, yeah, it can do a little bit, but I'm still going to have to do a bit. So trying to manage people's relationship, do that change management piece of work is so important.
Yeah.
Whatever methodology you choose to use, ADKAR would be one we would use quite frequently. It's so important. And that middle dark blue box, for me, I think you hear a lot in the media about operational or organizational readiness, but for me, that really means human readiness. You've got to build people's trust in the tools that we're giving them. They've got to believe the outputs. You have to accept that there's going to be some error. No matter what tool you put in, there's always going to be some error. So you've got to define, what does an acceptable error rate look like? People are going to make errors as well. So understanding and accepting that is really important. And then explainability is a massive piece for me. Trying as much as we can not to treat these tools like black boxes, but encouraging people not to be afraid to challenge the output and say that needs to be better. That doesn't look like what I was expecting to see out of it. I want to keep some time for questions.
Yeah.
So I'm going to skip the next two slides.
Okay.
What I want to do is let me just jump into the very last one here for me.
Sure. What's the roadmap?
Yeah. So what are the takeaways? The title of the webinar is From Complexity to Clarity. So hopefully I haven't confused people more than they started with. I think the takeaway is that it's never one tool, and you've got to figure out your own organization, your own process, your own unique challenges to understand what's going to work best for you. So don't expect a one size fits all. There are some key things you can do in the next 30 to 60 days that are going to be fundamental to driving a better strategy and delivering better AI projects. We've talked about master data, so auditing your data quality, understanding your data gaps, being really honest internally in the organization, ideally documenting that as something that you can come back to and hopefully improve over time. That's really important. I would say mapping your processes and understanding where have people put in workarounds, where are they jumping into spreadsheets to solve problem, where are they being a duck on a pond where there's actually a huge amount of work that's happening underneath. I was in a recent project where their master data looked good, it looked very well structured, but they had 4 or 5 different names for the same product in their master data, which didn't matter when they were doing it manually because the planner could see and know what each one of those meant and knew they were all the same product, which was actually named something different on the factory floor. So they did that translation automatically. When we started to try and automate that caused some very obvious and very quick problems. And then I would look at, where do we want to try and start first? Where's the biggest ROI that we think we can tackle? Because that builds momentum internally in the organization that we can then leverage later on. When we look at the kind of more AI specific parts of it, I'm a firm believer that AI has massive opportunity for almost every planning organization in a manufacturing sense, whether that's machine learning or AI. Maybe we'll touch on Gen AI and agentic AI as well in a different session, but they have massive opportunity to help us to scale the decision making, to speed it up, and to allow organizations to run much faster. I would keep pushing that experimentation piece. It can be easy to run some experiments pretty quickly. And then looking long term, this is the wave of magic wand kind of question. Ultimately, extending AI across the supply chain allows you to interlink complex operations that are happening, which then allows the entire organization to move faster. And the example I used earlier was combining the demand planning and supply planning together, but let's run MRP all the way through to our commands, out to logistics and distribution planning, and then all the way up to trade and promotion management, for example. That's the kind of vision for how to get all of this coming together.
So I got a quick question for you before we take questions from the audience. So the supply chain planning space is littered with more solution providers than maybe ever. And a lot of the folks that I know or follow, not a lot, but some of them, look at AI and say it's going to make demand planners just obsolete. What do you say to that? What's your thought process on that?
I don't
Sorry
believe.
to hold your feet to the fire there, but
no,
it's something that I'm seeing all the time, and I'm a big believer in humanizing the process. So what are your thoughts on it?
In the next 5 years, definitely not.
Yeah,
In the next 10 years, who can say? I
yeah.
mean, ChatGPT and LLMs are only out 2 or 3 years and they've already transformed everything that we do. In the
Hmm.
short term, the models are great, but organizations are inherently set up where there's knowledge floating around that you're only ever going to hear at a water cooler. And I
Yeah,
don't have an AI standing at a water cooler just listening.
yeah,
There's, hey, I know that we're doing a promotion that's not in the demand yet because I was talking to the people and I've heard it's going to happen. So we need to start thinking about that already. Or I know that that supplier is running late because they had an issue in their factory and they haven't told us about it yet. But hey, I know I heard from somebody else
sure.
and they've told me that's an issue. So across the spectrum, planners are integral to that process, and they can always add value that a machine can't. So I'm completely with you. I'm very human centric on this.
Good, good. So, you ready for a few questions before we wrap
Sure.
it up from the audience? So I think a good segue into that is we've got a question from Denise, and Denise wants to know, Kevin, why can't I use Claude or Chat GPT for supply planning or demand sensing?
And I know people who've tried. I think at its core, Claude or ChatGPT are large language models. And for me, the key is in the name, right? This is all about language. They're amazing at helping me to write marketing copy or craft a LinkedIn post or analyze a document. So they're really good at that kind of pattern matching side of it. But there's a whole other suite of AI tools that are very mathematical in their nature. So demand sensing and constraint optimization would be two of them, where there's deep operational research that has gone in over the last 20, 30 years to define the mathematics of operation of that. And while Claude or ChatGPT can interact with those mathematical models, nobody's trying to build Claude to be a mathematical model. They're trying to build it as a more general tool that we can interact with. Now, I think they're amazing at helping me to interpret the results that are coming from those machine learning or AI models. So they're great at the interpretation piece or using it to kick off new solves, for example. That's a great way of using those tools. So I certainly think they've got a place, but at its core, they're solving a very different problem.
Got a question from Syed. That's great feedback. Got a question from Syed. How long does it take to implement or run a pilot with Demand Chain AI?
How long is a piece of string, which is a terrible answer, but it depends on the complexity. Most of the time, I would target running, if you've got the data on the demand sensing side, we target running a pilot in a month, maybe a little bit under it if you've got the data. On the supply planning side, depends on the complexity of the operation. We'll usually try and solve a slice of that of the factory. It's usually a little bit longer, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. And again, it's all about the data. Oftentimes, you've got challenges on the supply planning side where a huge amount of the data is locked in people's heads or it's buried in spreadsheets and it may be of questionable quality. So we spend a bunch of that time working with organizations to try and solve those gaps in the data.
Good stuff. All right, we've got another one from Lee. Kevin, data security is always a concern. How do you manage it for these AI models?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes up everybody I talk to. It kind of goes back to what I mentioned, what the difference between something like a ChatGPT or a Claude and more of these mathematical models. The demand sensing models, so the machine learning one or Replan's AI constraint optimization are segregated models, so they don't sit in a publicly accessible cloud. Once we feed data into them, that's not feeding a model that's owned by Anthropic, for example, or OpenAI. These are segregated data models that sit within an isolated private cloud, and they don't need to interact with any other data externally. The only exception would be where we're looking to bring in point of sale data into demand sensing to provide a better signal. In that case, we'll pull data in, but we will sit the whole thing in a fully isolated and secure container. So that's why it's another reason why it's different to the likes of Claude, where you're potentially, depending on your settings, you don't have to, but you're potentially feeding a bunch of data in that's supporting their model development. And of course, it's your data, it's your demand forecast, it's incredibly sensitive. The last thing you'd want to be doing is pushing that data up into a public model.
Okay, so just for me and for the audience, because we are exactly at 40 minutes, so let's put a bow on this at a very high level. Why don't you put a bow on this topic? Just key takeaways, everything, some parting shots before we wrap up today's session, which I've really enjoyed. Fantastic presentation.
No, yeah, I've really enjoyed the questions. Have been great. Thank you to the audience. For me, the AI train is leaving or has left the station. I think the time now, or it's now the time to look internally, get yourself ready, get a strategy in place, and start experimenting. And you will learn so much from running and failing a couple of experiments. Your team will learn about it. They'll set the expectation that failure is acceptable because we're testing and we're going to learn so much about it. There's, as you said, a huge number of vendors in the space at the moment. There's lots of exciting technologies. Kind of, we didn't touch on agentic AI, but that's the very hot topic at the moment.
Yeah.
But start with the business problem. Start with the problem you're trying to solve. Be super clear on that. Be super clear on the KPIs, the levers you're trying to pull. And that will help you to decide on the tools you're going to use. And when you're talking to vendors, you'll bring that clarity. They're going to help to give you an answer much quicker, and ultimately help you to get to the right place.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And real quick, how can they get in touch with, beyond going to demandchainai.com? Any other good ways to get in touch with you guys and the team? And I will tell you, I met Rick Davis in 2022, and what he's built at Demand Chain AI in a short amount of time has been pretty impressive.
I hop on the website. I think, if I go to the next slide, actually, thank you for reminding me, our contact details should be on at demandchainai.com. There's a very obvious button on the top of the webpage that allow you to get in contact. And we've got a fantastic team there that'll take that. If you give a little bit of detail, they'll direct you to an expert on our team who can get on a call and answer some questions, and come with questions. We love questions.
Good stuff. Well, everybody, just a reminder, be on the lookout for the on-demand version. It'll be in your hands tomorrow. We're also going to create some video snippets out of this that if you don't have time for whatever reason to watch the entire session, hopefully you do, but if you don't, there's going to be some great video content, highlight reels, so be on the lookout for that. But that's going to do it for today. I want to thank everybody again for attending today's session. I'm sure you got a lot of value out of it. I also want to thank Dr. Kevin O'Flynn. Hope we can do it again soon.
Absolute pleasure, Jason. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yep. Have a great day.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.